And green light. Looks like we're good to go. All right, George, welcome. How are you, my friend?
Well, thank you for having me.
This is so cool for me. I'm so excited. I'm going to explain why in a second. But first, let me just read a little bit of an intro for the few people that listen to me that don't know quite about you yet. But George is a self-described
Sure.
macro addict, entrepreneur, investor, and real estate expert. You own real estate all over the world. But more importantly, you have a perspective on macroeconomy and geopolitics that I just think is fascinating. It's fun to listen to. It's always right. It always checks out. Your YouTube channel has exploded this year. I started listening to you at the beginning of the year, and now you're getting like
Okay.
10 times the views in a week that you used to. And I think it's because you're speaking truth and people find what you're saying really informative. And you arm your audience with the necessary information to protect ourselves with the madness that's going on in the world and with central banking activity. So I sent your assistant this, like, it was like 3 paragraphs of things I wanted to go over with you. And I had a
Yeah,
hard time figuring out where do I jump? Like, where do I start? Like, what makes sense? So for
sure.
me, I noticed a theme over the last several weeks of you've done a lot on central banking and the Fed. I thought, let's start there. You just interviewed ex-Congressman or House Representative Ron Paul.
Yeah.
And so I thought, look, let's start with the Fed. Let's just start like talk to me like a 5-year-old about the Fed. I think the first Fed chairman to kind of be famous maybe was Volcker, and then everyone knew Greenspan. He was a household name. What is the Fed? What do they do? How important are they? And then we'll start getting more into nuance. But I'd love to hear you kind of start with just a really kindergarten explanation of the Fed.
Okay, so the Fed is the central bank for the United States. And technically it's privately owned. I mean, you could have a huge debate as to how much government control is actually over the Federal Reserve, but currently they're in charge of creating bank reserves. And I hesitate to say dollars because they don't really create dollars in the form that most people understand them. So let me just back up a little bit there as well. So we've got 2 forms of money in the economy, or 2 ways of measuring it that are used just in general terms. We have base money, and that's the money that the Federal Reserve prints. So that would be a liability on their balance sheet, just like a checking deposit. A customer checking deposit is a liability for a normal bank. And then you have broad money. And the broad money is kind of or M2 money supply, is the dollars that most people would think about that circulate within the real economy. But those 2 things are different. And a lot of people think that there's a causal relationship between the 2. And that's not really true. There can be, but not always. And what most people don't realize is the banking system, the commercial banking system, creates the majority of the broad money supply in the real economy through lending. So if you've got a loan that you take out from the bank, let's say to buy a house for $100,000, that's $100,000 of money supply that did not exist prior to you taking out that loan. And then conversely, if you immediately paid that loan off, then that would be a reduction in the broad money supply of $100,000. Now it really gets into the nitty gritty, which I won't do here. I've interviewed guys like Jeff Snyder that understand the plumbing of the dollar funding markets like no one I've ever seen. And he would argue that M2 money supply is really unquantifiable. But we won't get that right now. We'll just assume it's this broad money that circulates in the real economy. So where the Fed comes in, let's kind of look at it prior to 2008 and then after 2008, because there's a big difference. So prior to 2008, the Fed would really manage the Fed funds rate. We hear that all the time. Well, what are interest rates?
Right.
That's really just talking about the Fed funds rate. So they set a target rate where banks lend to each other overnight, and by lowering that rate, they try to, and emphasis on try, they try to stimulate lending and therefore economic activity. And prior to 2008, they would do this by creating these bank reserves, and they create the bank reserves to buy assets, mostly treasuries, sometimes mortgage-backed securities, from what we call primary dealer banks. And I'm not sure how many of them there are, but they're like a JP Morgan, something like that. So what happens is the JP Morgan has these treasuries, let's say, on their balance sheet, and that's an asset on their balance sheet. And so the Fed would buy those treasuries from a JP Morgan. So that would go onto the asset side of the Fed's balance sheet. And then it would just magically create, I call funny money, but these bank reserves that are basically them just punching
numbers in a computer. Right.
And numbers into a computer. That's right. For JP Morgan's bank account that they have with the Fed. So a lot of if you want to look at them as checking accounts, these primary dealer banks they're held with the Fed, and that's the bank reserve. So they just type in an extra, let's say, $1 billion into JP Morgan's reserve account for those $1 billion worth of treasuries that the Fed purchased. Okay, so that's how they increase the amount of bank reserves. Well, these bank reserves are what the commercial banks lend to one another overnight. Now we don't have reserve requirements, but prior to COVID, we actually had reserve requirements in the United States of, let's say, 10%. Now it was different based on the size of the bank, but we'll just say 10% to make it easy. So then let's say there was a bank that was did a bunch of loans, so they were down to 8%. Well, they could just go ahead and borrow the bank reserves needed to achieve that 10% to hit the regulation.
Right.
And they would borrow overnight. Well, the more reserves that are in the system, well, technically it's supply and demand, and the lower the interest rate. And so that's how the Fed would kind of manage rates, if you will. And
let me pause for 1 second to describe the difference between the Fed fund rate and then the general interest rate that we all experience by going and taking out a mortgage. How are the two connected?
Okay, well, that's more of a market rate. So it's loosely tied to the Fed funds rate. I mean, the Fed funds rate has it really manipulates what we call the short end of the yield curve. So the closer the maturity is to the Fed funds rate, the more control it has. But if you go out to the 10-year or the 30-year, then that's going to be much more of a market interest rate that's determined on several different factors, one of which is inflation expectations. So, and then the 10-year is loosely tied to mortgage rates. So if the market is seeing absolutely no inflation, if they're saying deflation, as an example, then you might see the interest rate on the 10-year, let's call it 1%. Well, most likely mortgage rates would be a lot lower than if the 10-year was at 5%. There's usually a bit of a delta.
They are loosely connected, though. That's a good point to make.
Yeah, but I mean, they don't track exactly, but over a long period of time, typically if the Fed funds is going down, 10 years going down, and then mortgages go down as well. And that's pretty much the Fed's, that was their strategy, if you want to call it that, post 2008, is let's bring down the long end of the yield curve. So we bring down interest rates in the real economy and stimulate borrowing and stimulate demand. It's this Keynesian approach where they increase the demand side of the equation. They think that kind of that tide raises all boats in the harbor. I would argue that it really doesn't, but that's a whole other discussion.
Well,
that's the way they think, right?
Isn't that part of their boom bust psychology of this is the way markets work anyway? So is that part of why they have inflation targets? Is to kind of create this boom bust? Credit is easy, then they make it harder to get. Am I on the right track there?
Kind of. I mean, there were people like Krugman that came out in the early 2000s after the dot-com bust and literally said, we need to create a housing bubble, or we need to create another bubble to make up for the bubble that just burst. And because they're just strictly focused on demand, and they think that if it's government spending, regardless of what it is, as long as there's demand to fill the void, then we're all good. Then we just buy time until animal spirits and entrepreneurs go out there and start creating economic activity that brings everything back, and then we can lay off the alcohol in the punch bowl. But unfortunately, I don't think it works that way at all. But after 2008, the Fed came in, as we know now, with quantitative easing. So that's buying the long end of the yield curve to try to bring those rates down. Now, it really didn't work, but they tried to bring those rates down. So that floods the market, that floods the system with these bank reserves that we were talking about, which would bring, and since they created so many of these bank reserves, the rate would go right down to 0% and they could not raise it. There's just too many reserves. The only way they could raise it is by selling assets, which they didn't want to do, because that would potentially raise interest rates on those assets. And that was the opposite of what their intention was. So they had to come up with a new system. So they came up with something called interest on excess reserves, IOER, or interest on reserves. And what they did basically said, listen, we'll pay the banks, let's say 1%, in order to keep their bank reserves held here at the Fed in their checking accounts. So that essentially puts a floor on interest rates on the Fed funds, even regardless of how many bank reserves are actually in the system, because no one's going to lend at under 1% when they could just park their money and get the 1%. There's no reason to take that risk. So this is kind of how they micromanage it now, and it's not a market function. And because of that, they had to do some other things with reverse repo. It gets pretty technical, but that's basically how the Fed manages the Fed funds rate, which theoretically has kind of like a trickle down effect or a trickle through effect through the entire yield curve. And the strategy, I would argue that it doesn't really work, but the strategy is to bring down interest rates to stimulate economic growth.
And that's where we're at now. That's what the Fed is trying to do right now.
Well, now they've gone off the deep end. I mean, now they've gone from quantitative easing to propping up the repo market. Back in March, they were committing to $1 trillion a day. Now they weren't doing $1 trillion a day, but they're committing to $1 trillion a day in repo transactions, if that's what it took. It's QE infinity. They've created all these 4 and 5 letter alphabet soup bailout packages for the big corporations. Now they're buying junk debt through ETF, junk debt of corporations. They're buying high yield corporate debt. The Federal Reserve Act does not allow that in any way, shape, or form, but they're completely ignoring the Federal Reserve Act. They're ignoring the law. And that's why they're now such a huge part of the economic discussion. You talked about Volcker before. Mm-hmm. And I mean, who was one Fed chair prior to Volcker? I mean, can anyone name? No, because it didn't matter.
That was my point. Yeah, that's why I said him, because no one knows that. It was Volcker and then Greenspan and then Powell. No one,
It wasn't a big deal. The Fed really wasn't this, it might have been as powerful, but it wasn't that much of a talking point within the market discussion on where stocks are going, where bonds are going. Now, it's like the Fed is the sun. It's like everything just revolves right around the Fed and the Fed's decisions. I mean, even their meeting minutes, everyone goes to them with a fine-tooth comb and just tries to analyze every single word that Jerome Powell says. And the markets go up or down based on every single period or comma or exclamation point. And it's just complete insanity. If you think that the stock market should be a reflection of the actual fundamentals of the companies themselves, as opposed to just the liquidity that the Fed is giving to the market. It's gone from how much profit is a company making or their potential profit in the future to how much heroin is the Fed going to give us now and potentially in the future. And the market, I've argued that the market now almost has an inverse correlation to the real economy. In other words, the worse the real economy does, the better the stock market does, because that means the Fed comes in with a put, if you will, and provides more liquidity that has the effect. Now, whether it's a direct effect or just a psychological effect, you could argue that, but still we've seen the markets go up as a result. And I would also argue that now we've gone from a Fed put to more of a government put. And when I'm talking about a put, I'm just talking about a backstop to the market. So since 2008, We have all these banks, hedge funds, financial institutions that are taking exponentially more risk. Well, why is that? Because they're just rational players that are just trying to pursue their own self-interest. And they're thinking, okay, well, if we're quote unquote too big to fail, we can take on all this risk, and it just behooves us because the gains are privatized and the losses are socialized, meaning if we make a profit, we get to
100%.
keep that profit.
But if we lose
we
it, we
go
get bailed
bust,
out.
we take a loss, then we get bailed out by the taxpayer. So why wouldn't you just take all this additional risk? It creates all of this moral hazard. It creates a misallocation of resources. And I mean, I could go down the list of the negative effects, but we can see that through the financialization of the entire economy. And to the extent now that we're seeing in the market where we've got companies who are quite literally bankrupt, and people are still coming in and buying their newly issued stock for who knows what reason, because they think the Fed's going to come in and bail out Hertz or Chesapeake or whatever. I mean, that's the level of insanity that we're dealing with right now. And it all goes back to the Fed trying to micromanage the economy. Another way to look at this is I see the economy as a complex system, very similar to nature. So if we think about nature, there's no way man can control nature because there's just too many variables. It's just, you know, we go back to the butterfly effect, where a butterfly that flaps its wings in Japan or whatever creates a tsunami in Mexico or whatever, you know, something like that. Or we also see it too, where, you know, you have like an insect problem in Florida, let's say, and we smart humans come in with these frogs that will eat the insects, thinking, well, this is going to solve the problem. And the next thing you know, we've got a frog problem that's 1,000 times worse than the original insect problem. We just can't do it as human beings. But for some, and I would argue that the more we try to manipulate the environment, the worse we make it. And ironically, you know, the people on the left that really favor big government, they're the ones that typically would agree that man's intervention in a complex system like nature is a really bad thing.
That's a good point.
But for some reason, man's intervention in another complex system like the economy is a good thing. And it's actually, you know, we need more of it. It's required. So I don't understand that, not to go off on a tangent, but going back to the Fed, we look at it's basically like a centralized group of, let's call them 10 or 15 people who knows what their motivation is, that are trying to manage or micromanage not only nature, but the weather and everything else involved. And I believe the more they try to manage it, the worse they make it in the long run. It's not to say that they can't come up with a Band-Aid that's a temporary solution, but in the long run, the more resources that you misallocate and the more malinvestment you have, at some point you're going to have to pay the fiddler. And it's just, you're making the problem a lot bigger by kicking that can down the road. A lot of people that argued for these most recent bailouts that we had because of the virus, oddly enough, were people who, in retrospect, said that we shouldn't have bailed out any of the banks in 2008 or 2009. And if we would not have bailed out these people in 2009, that our economy would be a lot healthier. But that's a bizarre argument to me, because wouldn't that be the exact same argument right now? Like if we bail out these companies, aren't we just going in 2025, let's say, or 2030, aren't we going to be in even a worse place than we were, regardless of how bad COVID would have been on the economy in March or April of 2020? I would argue that we would be. And it's just far better. It would have been better to take the medicine back in 2008 than to take the medicine in 2020. But it would be far better to take the medicine in 2020 than in 2025 or 2030.
All right, so before we go down the road of what the medicine is, I want to ask you one more thing about the Fed, because we're talking about the missteps they're making. But I think it's interesting that if you follow the money with the Fed, and you figure out, okay, yeah, they're a private institution, but then who owns it? And there was this Freedom of Information Act that was filed on, well, who does own it? Who is the controlling share, the ownership of capital shares, right? And you did a piece on that as well. And it's like you're following it, you're connecting the dots, and then you get to the Fed, and then who owns the Fed? And you actually come back down to its Citibank. It's like you hit the top, and all of a sudden you realize there's a revolving door up here at the top. It's like the biggest banks, and then minority owners are China and Japan's central bank. So it's like, now that's the way it obviously must have been working for a while, but can that keep working? Or do we need a group of civil servants at the top? Or can it be basically this really small niche of a corporate hierarchy that can decide, make all the decisions that the Fed is making?
Well, I think you should eliminate the Fed. I don't see a reason for the Fed. I'd eliminate it altogether. And I'd just go with the good old market forces to determine interest rates. I mean, we've only had a Fed since 1913. So if we could go through the entire 1800s, and I would argue the latter stages of the 1800s were probably the best economy from a standpoint of numbers that we've ever seen. We had 3% roughly deflation in the 1870s, 1880s. So prices were actually going down by on average 3% per year. And people look at that, and they're, especially if they're from the Keynesian school, they're just horrified. They're like, oh my, that's the worst thing that could possibly happen. We must have just gone into Armageddon, and we must have gone into this abyss or black hole of economic horribleness, But you actually see that while prices were going down by 3%, give or take, per year, nominal wages.
And you mean asset prices
going up?
You mean asset prices?
No, nominal wages.
Oh, nominal wages. Okay.
So wages of the average Joe and Jane were actually going up by roughly 1% per year. We had positive nominal rates of 4%. So that means real rates that you were getting just by putting your money in a bank account would have been 7%. We had positive nominal GDP. So the economy was actually growing while prices were contracting and going down. So the purchasing power of the everyday person just got higher and higher and higher. I used an example, in one of my videos that I think really hits home just for something we can all relate to. And that's whether, now or maybe when we were a teenager or something like that, a lot of us worked in a fast food, maybe a pizza place, something like that. Mm-hmm. So I just use the example of someone working at McDonald's, because you always hear this from, we have to pay a living wage, and we have to do, we have to micromanage the economy. We got it because the free market won't take care of it on its own. But if you think back to the late 1800s, this is when we had an extremely free market. There was very little regulation, a lot of competition, and obviously no income taxes. But going back to that, let's say that you're the average McDonald's worker or so, and you're making $1,500 a month. And we'll just assume that your expenses are also around $1,500 a month. So you've got no savings. We've all heard the story. Mm-hmm. If you worked at that McDonald's for 20 years and you never went from being the guy making the fries to the manager, the cashier, or you never got a promotion, mm-hmm. You just did the exact same job, right? But your wages went up by 1% per year. At the end of 20 years, you'd be making roughly $1,800 a month. So a pay increase in nominal terms of $300, right? Most people would say, oh my gosh, that's terrible. That's a nightmare. We've got to pay them a living wage, see what happens in the free market, but they're not looking at the expense side of the equation. That same person's expenses would have gone from $1,500 a month down to $800.
So that's why.
Okay, so their purchasing power at the end of the month, they went from having zero in mm-hmm. disposable income to $1,000 a month in disposable income. And that's if they're working the exact same job. And I'm not even calculating if they would have taken the money that they started saving as a result of prices going down, putting it into the bank, and that compounding at a 7% real rate per year. You see, so
Right, right.
so what's the way, you know? And another thing that people really kind of the buzzword right now that I don't like, and I'm actually trying to stop using the phrase myself, is the wealth gap or inequality or something like that. I don't know why we are focused on inequality when we should really be focused on improving the lives and the standard of living of the poor and middle class. Because who cares what the wealth gap is, as long as we're improving the lives of, or we're maximizing, we're increasing the lives of those kind of at the bottom of the income scale as much as possible. I mean, do we want everyone equally poor? Would that be a more desirable outcome than having a big wealth gap, but the trajectory of the standard of living of those at the bottom of the income scale always improving? So I think we really need to change the terminology. Instead of focusing on inequality and the wealth gap, we focus on improving the lives of the poor and middle class. You know, how can we do that? And people just assume that if we take money from these people and give it to these people, then we're improving their lives. But that's such weak thinking. And that I don't know if you've read any of Thomas Sowell's books, but he's shown that nowhere in history can you find a group of individuals that have gone from poverty to affluence by the interventions of government. And if you think about that, you know, whether it's the Chinese, the Jews, the Malaysians, the Irish, the Germans, any group of individuals, you know, when they've gone to another country, or maybe they started extremely poor, no group of individuals got to the middle class. Or, you know, you look at the Japanese Americans, right? Or Chinese Americans. Now, every single income graph you look at, they're almost always at the top, right?
Yeah.
And so you say, well, you know, were they always there? Well, not really, you know, but no group, and that obviously is consistent. There's always those types of groups in every country, not just the United States. Sowell really gets focused on Malaysia because they have a minority group of Chinese that are heavily discriminated against, and went to Malaysia with absolutely nothing, like zero. And so anyway, wherever this has happened throughout throughout the world, it's never happened as a result of government coming in and intervening in the market. Never, ever, ever. So
I had a great podcast with one of my guests recently was Calla Rose. She worked with the San Francisco government on making sustainable systems. She said, you know, the government's job really is just setting up markets and then stepping back. Let them do what they do, but you have to incentivize where you want things to go. For example, solar and wind energy never would have had a chance if they had to compete openly against oil. So you have to kind of set up some sort of subsidies. I mean, do you agree with that? Right?
I'm not going to dispute whether that's right or wrong, but what I would dispute is the thinking. Because typically when I hear that type of thinking, they only focus on the benefits and they never think about the costs. Right. And when I'm talking about the costs, I'm not just talking about how much we're spending or how much we have to tax from XYZ individuals to subsidize the cost of, let's say, green energy. There's so many more costs that go into it, such as we're dealing with limited resources with alternative uses. Right. No one really thinks that through. And I'm not saying that on net balance, that wouldn't be desirable. I'm not saying that it would or wouldn't, but what I am saying is you never ever hear anyone that argues those types of things doing a cost benefit analysis. And whenever I'm talking to someone or when I'm listening to someone on a podcast or YouTube, I always, you know, whenever they're arguing for a specific narrative or whenever they're debating a specific position, I always believe that if the person truly understands their position, they should be able to argue the opposite side just as well, if not better, than their opponents.
I agree with that.
And that's one of the reasons on my whiteboard videos, you can watch one whiteboard video where I'll outline how, you know, we're going to have an economic collapse due to hyperinflation.
Right.
And on the very next whiteboard video, I'll argue how we could have an economic collapse due to deflation.
Deflation, right? Yeah.
Because I'm trying to understand just every argument so then I can come to my own conclusion as to what the probabilities are.
Right.
And there are no certainties, there are only probabilities. But that's the one thing that I'd say. Whenever I'm looking at government, I actually don't talk about this much. I think it would be probably better for one of my live streams. But I always look at the use of government or the proper use of government, I think, as Hannibal Lecter. And if you remember Silence of the Lambs,
I love
right?
it. Yeah, I do.
And I think it's a perfect analogy, because they had to use Hannibal Lecter to catch Buffalo Bill or whatever it was, right? But they knew that if they used him, they were playing with fire. I mean, you are playing with a nuclear reactor that you only would use as a last resort. And I think that's the same way that we should look at government. Instead of that, what we do is we say, oh my gosh, there's 49% of women in the workplace as opposed to, or in a STEM field. These aren't exact numbers, I'm just throwing out there as an example.
Right.
So we need to do something about it. Let's go to Hannibal Lecter. Let's take him out of the cage, right? Or, oh my gosh, we need a living wage. Oh, well, let's go to Hannibal Lecter.
Yeah.
Oh, we need to do X, Y, Z. Oh, Hannibal Lecter. Oh, we got a virus. Oh, Hannibal Lecter. That's our go-to. That's our default go-to guy. That Hannibal Lecter should not be the default go-to guy. He should be the very, very last resort if we are going to, if we're invaded by China or something, then you go to Hannibal Lecter.
Yeah.
But not for all these other things that should be worked out by the free market. I think that people don't understand that when they're dealing with government, you're playing with fire, just like that analogy. And my rationale for that is pretty straightforward. The argument that you hear against the private sector is always, well, we can't have the private sector is never going to be the referee because they're all greedy and they're pursuing their own self-interest, as though the government officials themselves aren't greedy. Right. And I would argue that the government officials are, if you want to look at them on a scale of morality, are far, far, far lower than your average entrepreneur or even corporate CEO. I think most people that would see politicians as these kind of benevolent public servants have never dealt with politicians. And, I have. And I know how they operate. And I can tell you the individuals I've dealt with, other than Ron Paul, of course, are the absolute bottom of the barrel. I mean, these people are the dregs of society. And it really makes sense as to why, because what is required to be a good politician? You have to have no moral compass whatsoever. You have to be able to lie just through your teeth, just constantly lie. You have to be able to pander to all of these groups. You have to have no principles whatsoever. I mean, none, zero. You have to just be willing to say what and try to convince people you believe whatever is going to get you the most votes. And the bigger government gets, the more morally bankrupt the people that are going to strive for those positions will be. Because, you think about...
that's a great point.
Yeah. And I think everyone gets it. So I'll stop there before I go off on a tangent. That's really how I see government. And I think we would just be a lot better. Yeah. Do we want to get rid of Hannibal Lecter? Do we want to, put him on an island somewhere? No.
Keep him for a rainy day.
Confine him and use him only as a last resort.
Like that scene where they're rolling him out of his prison cell. He's got the mask on and he's strapped down. That's the way you keep Hannibal Lecter, right?
That's the government. Exactly.
Right. You don't give him his own resort in the Italian countryside, right? I want to touch on this. So right now, the Fed is buying up. They're buying up companies, corporate bonds. So we're looking at Japan with negative interest rates for quite a while. Same with the UK. It's come up at the beginning of the year. I think Jay Powell, not even at the beginning of the year, maybe even April, was like never going to happen. He's changed his stance on that. It seems a little bit. This is a two-parter. One is, are U.S. equities, specifically tech equities, like the last global safe haven for a good yield? Is that where everyone's going to be flocking? And if so, is that going to be the driving force for these asset prices? And two, should the Fed be allowed to buy these things? Isn't that kind of like cheating that Google and Facebook and Apple can basically sell these bonds to the government?
Well,
Or to the Fed,
I
rather,
mean,
sorry.
yeah, I don't think the Fed should be involved in the markets at all. I think that's another thing too, that people that argue typically against capitalism, they use this as an example of capitalism when it's quite the opposite. We need free markets, and free markets are where we have a profit, but we also have a loss. And the loss is just as important, if not more important, than the profit. And what that means is you got to let people fail. If you have a system where corporations or businesses or people, even individuals, aren't allowed to fail, it's not going to be anti-fragile. It's going to be even the fragility is going to increase over time. It's just like it's like the process of evolution. I see it as the exact same, in that if you have a business fail, they go through a Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It doesn't mean that all their assets just poof disappear. They still have the factories, they still have the employees, they still have all these things. And then what happens is an individual or a business, it consists of individuals who were prudent, who were smart, who were efficient, that are still in business, that were able to weather the storm, whether it was 2008, whether it was the COVID deal, whatever it was. Then they come in and they take over the assets. The strong survive. And therefore, moving forward, the economy is that much more efficient and that much more anti-fragile, which is what we want. But currently, we're doing the complete opposite. So my point is, I don't think the Fed should intervene at all. I mean, I don't even think they should be there. So I definitely don't think that they should be buying corporate debt. And I definitely don't think they should be buying corporate debt of companies like Apple that have, $50 billion of cash and $50 billion of stock. I mean, they basically have $100 billion sitting on their balance sheet. And for some reason, we're not allowing market forces to work buying their debt. And so that goes to a very interesting question. And I addressed this in one of my videos, and I don't know if you want to go down this rabbit hole, so stop me if you want to go off on a different topic. But everyone looks at the Fed and they get hyper-focused on their balance sheet. And they say, what is the Fed's balance sheet? Is it expanding to 7 trillion, 10 trillion? Are they doing quantitative tightening going down to 4 trillion or whatever? It's all about balance sheet stuff. Right. But no one ever talks about their P&L. And if the Fed is owned by private institutions, which most people would agree they are, and if these private institutions have a motive for profit, then I think we definitely need to consider the P&L when we're looking at what the Fed might do or what they have done in the past. And most people would argue, well, we can't do that because all the profits go to the Treasury. And the only thing the Fed pays their owners is a 6% dividend. And that goes back to 1913. And at surface level, that would seem true. But if you dig into the weeds a little bit, you see that it might not necessarily work that way. That the Fed has all these separate accounts that they don't really announce, and it's right there on their website. If you really dig through the blog posts, and you'll see how they're talking about this, that not everything is going to the Treasury. So then you ask yourself, okay, if not everything as far as profit is going to the Treasury, well, how much is? Is that like 50%?
Right.
Is that 1%?
And we don't.
How much
and we don't know. And, yeah.
We don't know.
And we don't audit them. Right. And this is why I love that you got Ron Paul, because he's the only guy that successfully, and even that, they only granted him a partial audit. Right.
Yeah. And if you saw my interview with him, he was like, oh, it's totally bogus. I mean, it was nonsense. Bullshit. They just let me audit like their hours and stuff like that. It wasn't really relevant to anything. But if we can assume that, okay, there is a profit motive there, then you have to look at, okay, well, now what is their expense? So their main expense right now would be what we talked about earlier, IOER. So the interest they have to pay all these banks on their reserves. Okay, well, they dropped that down to almost zero. So what they're effectively doing is they're dropping their expenses down to zero. And then they're buying all of these assets, which are corporate debt, with all this money that they're printing out of thin air, just typing in digits to people's bank accounts, right? But if you were motivated by profit, just you and I, let's say you and I owned a business where we could just print up our own funny money and buy corporate debt. Would you want to buy corporate debt of Lord and Taylor, or would you want to buy corporate debt of Apple?
Yeah, Apple, right?
See, so I don't want to. I mean, obviously, I have no proof of this. The only thing I can say is that if I owned the Fed, I would definitely want to buy companies that I knew I would get a substantial return and a lot of profit coming in that I could keep for myself if I was morally bankrupt, right? Yeah. And that would kind of make a little more sense as to why they were buying companies, the debt of companies that obviously don't need a bailout. You know, those companies could bail everyone else out. They could probably bail out half the companies on the S&P with as much cash as Apple has on their balance sheet. But you see, so I'm not saying that's the reason why. I'm just saying that, I mean, it makes sense.
And there's a point too that you've made before in other videos that Peter Schiff makes, and that I think Jeff Gunlock has made. By the way, you get all the best guys on your show. I love it. But the point is that by
Gunlock, though, I really like Gunlock. I know he generally he seems to just do interviews with Danielle DiMartino Booth, but I've interviewed Danielle, so maybe through Danielle I can hook up with Jeff. We'll see.
If anybody can, it'll be you for sure. Yeah. But the point, just to add and to finish that, close that loop, is that by them they're lowering our purchasing power, and people don't get that yet, and it's because milk hasn't quite gone to $12 a gallon yet, but it might. Your purchasing power is literally getting diminished every time they're printing like this, and they're printing it and they're buying up some of the best things you can buy. They're buying up these assets, they're buying up good debt. So that's a strong point to make.
Yep. Let me explain that, just unpack that a little,
please.
A little more for your listeners or viewers, because it when they print up the bank reserves, so that would be base money, it doesn't necessarily directly affect M2 money supply. So the money that's circulating within the economy, chasing these goods and services you're talking about. But what have we gotten into now? And I think on your notes, you're talking about the Fed monetizing the debt.
I did.
And so let's go into that. So what does that mean? So the government issues a treasury at an auction. So they need to spend, they pass a $3 trillion stimulus. They need to get the money for this. So now the MMT crew would say that they don't, but
sorry, I want to say one thing right there. So because a lot of people are saying the understanding of treasury is that the government owns nothing. That treasury is basically the future labor of its citizens, which can be argued that's the only thing the only asset they really have. Is that right?
Yeah, the ability to tax their citizens. Yeah, if you want to get down to the fundamentals of it,
that's all a treasury is, right? It represents future. Okay.
Or it represents the ability for the Fed to print up funny money and just buy it. But that's where we get into banana republic mode, which is basically what debt monetization it really is. So if the government issues this treasury, we'll just say it's for $1 billion, just one treasury to make it easy. And then they auction that off at the auction. Well, if there's really no buyers at a specific interest rate, then the primary dealers will buy that treasury. And then the primary dealers will just, within minutes, sometimes they'll just flip it right to the Fed in that process we talked about earlier. Okay. But if they're flipping it to the Fed pays for that with newly created bank reserves. Okay, and they just add the digits to the bank reserves of the primary dealer bank who bought the $1 billion worth of treasury at auction. Okay, well, how is that different than you or I? Let's say we have $1 billion and we buy that treasury. Okay, well, the difference there is that we would buy it with existing money supply, because we would buy it with money that was in our checking account held within the commercial banking system. So there's a difference, because it's coming out of a deposit account instead of a reserve account held at the Fed. So we understand how it would work if you or I bought the billion, but let's go back to how it works with the Fed. So they buy that $1 billion worth of treasuries. The money goes into the reserve account of, let's call it JP Morgan, but the $1 billion went from JP Morgan to the Treasury. Okay, so now what does the Treasury do? Now the Treasury takes the $1 billion and spends it into the real economy. So now what you have is a direct transfer mechanism from base money turning into broad money. It not only increases the bank reserves at the Fed, but it also increases M2 money supply. So if the Fed just prints up bank reserves, let's say they do 100 trillion in quantitative easing, it doesn't necessarily get into the real economy. It would just expand the balance sheet capacity of the primary dealer banks to lend and create more money. But if the government borrows or the Fed monetizes $100 trillion of debt that the government spends into the economy, that would increase bank reserves, but it would also increase the amount of money that was chasing the same amount of goods and services, or potentially even less goods and services now that we have as a result of COVID, and what I would argue would be future increased government regulation that's going to strangle small and mid-sized business. That's the big difference there that most people don't get.
Thank you for making that distinction. So you really can't get around the fact that you have to produce. The economy needs to be producing things, because you can print more money, you can give more to the banks. All they do is lend. They're not producing, right?
I think Schiff gives the best example of this, and I don't know his exact example, but basically it's, let's say you've got $1 billion of green pieces of paper. If you had that in a suitcase here in the United States, you'd be rich, right? You could buy anything you want. But if you had it on a desert island, how rich would you be? Well, you wouldn't be rich, because there's nothing you can buy, because there are no products, there's no goods or services that exist. So the production has to come before the consumption. You have to have things. And what producing does is it allows us as a society to consume. Someone has to produce. Even here in the United States, where we consume far more than we produce, and that's reflected by our trade deficit year after year after year, someone's got to produce that stuff. Whether it's people in Vietnam, whether it's people in Germany, whether it's people in China, Japan, someone is producing the stuff for us to consume that we don't produce ourselves. Well, and so a lot of people talk about deglobalization or bringing those supply chains back to the United States, but we don't have the infrastructure. We don't have don't have the factories. We don't have anything. We don't have it set up. So again, that's one of those cost benefit analysis, that people are only looking at the benefits and that they're not looking at the costs and asking themselves, well, what would the unintended consequences be? And of course, the unintended consequences would be, we would have, for a period of time, we would have far fewer goods and services, and therefore inflation, or consumer price inflation, maybe not asset prices, but consumer price inflation would most likely go through the roof, which is stealing purchasing power from people who have behaved prudently, i.e. savers. And so we're disincentivizing
middle class, right?
People, the middle class, that's right. We're disincentivizing people, and retirees too. We're disincentivizing people to behave prudently, and we're incentivizing bad behavior, speculation, gambling, and that's the moral hazard that's been created by the Fed, going back to, I would say even the early 90s, but more specifically, it's easier to pinpoint 2001, after the dot-com bust, where Greenspan came in and tried to goose the economy, which I would argue was one of the major contributors to the housing bubble. Then you fix that. It's the same thing where the arsonist and the firefighter are one and the same.
Right. I love that. I think that the statistic is 70% of our GDP is consuming. So that, are we just screwed because of that figure alone? Because we have to start producing at some point.
Well, if 70% of your, what that does is that creates a very fragile economy. And it's because you're reliant on other countries for the majority of the goods. You know, to your point, we're not, and that's you see in that in the trade deficit. So what's happening is all of those green pieces of paper are going out to these other countries. Now, normally that wouldn't be a huge problem, because then that would just drive down the value of the currency, and it would increase exports, and it would have this equilibrium effect. But with the US having the reserve currency and excess and artificial demand for those currency units, then our dollar doesn't go down where it should be based on our level of productive output or exports. So what ends up happening is we just run these trade deficits year after year after year after year after year. There is no equilibrium. And therefore, those green pieces of paper are going out to other countries. Well, what are they doing with those green pieces of paper? They're going to buy US denominated or US dollar denominated assets. So at a certain point, Americans don't own anything anymore. And I'm not saying that's going to come in the next few months or something, but you just take that to its logical conclusion.
Yeah.
And the foreigners own everything, and we're basically just servants living in our own country of all the foreigners that own all the stuff, or all the production and all the assets.
All right, let me take that to ask you some investment advice.
Sure.
So if you're a millennial right now, you're looking at all-time low bond rates, all-time high equity values, all-time high property values. Where do you put your money?
You put your money into starting an online business, and then you take that and you parlay it into a house hack, is what we call it. So I'll start with a house hack. So
okay.
How I define that is if you go in and you buy a triplex or a fourplex, and you live in one of the units, and you rent out the other two units, and you have your renters paying your mortgage, your property insurance, your taxes, and you are living mortgage free. You're living rent free. And ideally, you'd have a little bit of positive cash flow coming in from that. And then what you do is you take what you would have spent on rent or your mortgage payment, and you start investing. And you start investing prudently. You invest in stuff that's cheap, and you wait and you don't sell it until it gets expensive. You invest in
what's cheap
right now, commodities.
Commodities. Okay.
Commodities, and you've got equities in other countries. But if you're just talking US centric and stuff that's denominated in dollars, I would start there. I was listening to Jim Grant on Grant Williams' podcast that he does with Bill Fleckenstein the other day. And Jim was pointing out that commodities relative to financial assets are at 120-year low, going back to 1900. So that's pretty damn cheap. And you look at, it's tough to buy commodities directly. I don't know if I'd suggest people mess around with futures unless they really know what they're doing, but you can do it through the producers of these agricultural products, or oil, uranium, what have you. So that's where I'd start looking right now. But I think that house hack is the best way to do it. And then the millennials have a huge edge right now in the fact that they're so computer literate. They grew up with these things. I'm 47 years old. I didn't grow up with a computer. We had, when I was a teenager, I remember we had like a Commodore 64, but it was more for like video games and stuff like that. It wasn't anything what we have today. So they grew up with this stuff. They have a huge edge right there. And I have, now that I've had this little YouTube channel and whatnot, and podcasts and stuff, I have a little bit of experience with online business, but I have a lot of experience with offline business. I was an entrepreneur up until 2012 when I retired. I've managed, I've started several different businesses. I've had businesses that have only had 5, 10 employees. I've had businesses that have had over 100 employees, and everything in between. So
what was the did you retire from real estate investment?
No. I didn't even start investing in real estate until I retired.
Oh, okay. What was your career? I'm curious. What was your career up until that point? Okay.
Yeah, I was an entrepreneur. As soon as I got out of college in the late 90s, the first thing I did was start a little t-shirt company. I was working valet at the Golden Nugget in Vegas.
No way.
I was working graveyards. So, and I did that intentionally because the graveyard shift then was 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. and you'd work 4 10s, and that would give you the majority of the day where I could focus on my business. And I would just sleep from like, I can't remember, like 4 or 5 in the afternoon to like 9, or 4 in the afternoon to 9 at night, or something like that. And then I'd take all the tip money that I was getting from working valet, and I just dumped that right into my t-shirt business. Now, of course, that was a miserable failure. It didn't work out, but it really, but it really taught me a lot. And yeah, I've had a lot of businesses that didn't work, but fortunately, I had a couple more that that panned out. And the last business I had, we started that in 2008 or so, I think the end of 2008, and by 2012. I had that up to over 100 employees, part-time, full-time, and doing 24 million in annual revenues and doing business all over the world and stuff. And that's when I kind of call it quits. So when I hung it up, when I was 38 years old in 2012, I knew nothing about investing. I knew nothing about macro. I didn't know what a yield curve was. I didn't know what the Fed was. Zero, absolutely zero. Not only that, but I was a horrible student. I almost flunked out of high school. And I always like to mention that, because people maybe see what I do with the YouTube videos or the people I interview, and they always say, oh, I could never do that. You know, George must have this background in economics, or he.
That's what I would have said.
Quite the opposite.
That's what I would have said. I watched one of your YouTube episodes, and it literally takes me a week to, either look up the book that you mentioned, or look up look at this podcast, look at this interview, look at this website. By the time I've done all that, a week has gone by at least, and you've made 5 more episodes in that time. I can't even keep up with looking at. So it's to be honest with you, it's intimidating, because I think people look at you and they're like, he's putting out so much valuable information and content. So he must have had a whole career. He must just have this, in his brain already from working it from 20 years. And so he's just basically sharing now. To think that you actually are still learning this stuff on the fly is incredible. I think it's amazing.
I appreciate your kind words, but yeah, I've never taken a finance class. I've never taken an econ class. I've never, like I said, I almost flunked out of high school. I ended up barely going to college, where my grades weren't that much better than they were in high school. It just never really appealed to me. But in 2012, I just really dove in head first. It was, the catalyst. I was in Singapore. I was staying at the Marina Bay Sands, and I had about 15 minutes before a dinner date there. We were eating at STK, one of my favorite steakhouses. Okay. And, but I had about 15 minutes to blow. And I just happened to be on YouTube, and I stumbled across Milton Friedman's Free to Choose series that he did.
Just watched that. I just watched that because I watched one clip from it because you brought that up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And that's what just, he just articulated so well what I'd had in my mind for so many years, and I'd never heard anyone just express it so well. And then I went on to Thomas Sowell, and then I really got into the Austrian side of things. Really made a lot more sense to me than anything else. Although I wouldn't consider myself a diehard Austrian, I like to just look at everyone's theories and just kind of see what I think is really kind of commonsensical approach. But then, Jim Rogers, Jim Grant, Schiff, and Druckenmiller, and I read all the Market Wizards books. So I've just got a lot of respect for all those people. In fact, the people that I interview on my show are pretty much the people that I've been listening to and just absorbing as much of their content as I could since 2012. And that's how really I learned. So it's just a huge honor for me to be able to interview the people I do. And but it's all self-taught. So my point there is, listen, if I'm someone that almost flunked out of high school, and if I can learn all of this stuff just by podcasts, audiobooks, YouTube, every single person listening to this or watching this can do the exact same thing. I can promise you that. And that goes back to the side hustle with the millennials. If no matter what you're interested in right now, you just obsess over, I promise you, within a year or two, you can be a quasi expert on XYZ topic, and you can provide value to an audience, and you can provide value to people on the internet or a community. And even if you're not an expert, I never claim to be an expert. I mean, I don't know how many of my interviews are live streams. I always tell people, listen, I'm an amateur. I'm no expert. I'm like the guys and gals I interview, they're the experts. So, you know, just take what I say with a grain of salt. I'm just some hack that came out here, you know, just because I like to do it as a hobby, because I love talking about this stuff. But
and your show too, your whiteboard is so unique, and the characters that you bring in, like your friend and family member Fred, who we can all relate to, and then Salt and Uncle Sam, who we can all relate to. I love these things. Let me ask you this then, just one more question down that path is, you know, you have, it looks like you have, I know you have the website, you've got a newsletter that you pump out, you've got the Rebel Capitalist show, you've got the YouTube channel by your name. Which one of these did you start with? Which one made the most financial sense first, or which one did you monetize first, or did you just go after all of them at the same time?
No. Actually, the YouTube channel was a result of a TV show I actually did in Medellin that I did in early 2019. It's just another example of you know, the typical entrepreneurial mindset where you shoot first and ask questions later. I had no idea how to create a TV show, but I pitched it to the local network as though, oh yeah, it's no problem. Don't worry about it. And once they greenlit it, then in about 2 weeks, I had to figure out actually how to produce a TV show, which so I really had to, you know, do a lot of research there. But anyway, after the TV show, the first season was done, I had all these awesome editors, camera people. So we parlayed that into the YouTube channel. So at the beginning, I was spending a significant amount of money on payroll because I knew that YouTube was a game of numbers and analytics. And if you just hit the numbers, then everything else would be a foregone conclusion. So I just really dove into, you know, the click-through rates and the retention rates on my videos, and really seeing, and just, you know, our first few videos, I mean, we're editing just wildly different from one video to the next. I was throwing everything up against a wall to see what would stick. And I didn't start with those whiteboard videos, by the way. And I didn't even start with macro videos. I started with real estate videos, but I found that people really enjoyed the macro better than the whiteboards, and that which fit perfect because that's what I like talking about. I know a lot about real estate, but I actually much prefer to talk about macro. So anyway, I knew it was all about building an audience, building a community. So we just really hit that as hard as we could until, and then my goal was just to get the ad revenue from YouTube just to kind of offset my payroll. Because I figured if I can just do this for free, if I can get up to a point where I'm making enough from AdSense or whatever it's called.
But it's paying for itself.
Yeah, then it's just kind of free and I'm just doing it as a hobby. And then I can just take my time into figuring out how to monetize and maybe make it a neat little side hustle, if you will.
Brilliant. That's brilliant.
And, you know, and I was willing to commit a significant amount of money to get it up to that point. So I figured, you know, if I'm dropping $5-6 grand a month, if I do this for a year, you know, you figure I dropped 75,000 on it. So that was really literally my mindset. I said, okay, you know, am I willing to allocate $75,000 to this just to give it a shot and see if it'll work? The answer was yes. So that's how we did it. Fortunately, the channel, it is true that YouTube, it's just really all about analytics. So it's kind of interesting how we were cranking out these videos that were taking a tremendous amount of time, because at the beginning I was doing whiteboard videos 5 days a week. And that was just insane hours. But the struggle and the hard part about that is that these videos are only getting like 20-30 views.
Yeah. And you're putting in like what, 4, 5, 6 hours? Probably
way more than that.
Okay, I would guess. I would think so.
Yeah,
okay.
just to shoot one of those whiteboard videos takes probably 4 hours, and then to edit it, I have a 2 people editing it. I had 3. That takes another probably 5 hours at a very minimum. And most people realize that when a rough draft edit, the editors send me the rough draft and I sit there and go through it.
You have to watch it again.
Change that.
Right.
So when you see like big words popping up, or when you see an animation going from one thing typically that's the editors doing it first. And then I'm there saying, oh, no, I don't like that animation. Let's do the animation this way.
Yeah.
And so I'm like the director, I'm like I'm like everything there. So my point is it takes at least 10 or 12 hours to do that. And that's without the research that goes into the video. So anyway, doing that.
I think that's really helpful for people to know that, though, because it does.
Yeah, most people think I just go up there for 15 minutes, hit record, and stop, and boom,
well,
upload, you're done.
Yeah, you do make it look easy. You make it look easy. That's why.
No, it's not that way at all. Yeah. So, but you're doing that and only getting like 20 views. I remember like 3 months into it, we only had like 200 subscribers, which back then I thought was fantastic. Mm-hmm. And I think we started maybe in June, or I can't remember when we started. It was about a year ago. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so after 3 months, you're really not doing it. But see, I knew that YouTube was a game of numbers. It was just it was just a matter of time. Where if you kept producing good content, that the YouTube algorithm mm-hmm. would pick it up. It's just a matter of time. But it's hard to discipline your mind to do that. I think going back to my days playing blackjack, I had a huge edge there. So anyway, we kept pushing. And all of a sudden, I remember one day I was looking at the analytics, and we were getting about, I think maybe 200 views a day for the entire channel, right? So then the very next week, so literally 7 days later, we were getting 40,000 views a day.
Wow.
So we went from 400 to 40,000.
The algorithm started working for you
within a matter of a week.
Wow.
And it actually was a lot less. I mean, within a matter of 3 or 4 days. So, I mean, it just exploded. And why is that? Because just like I knew it was all about the algorithm picking it up, and I just didn't have enough content there for the algorithm to take me seriously. And when I say me, I'm saying anyone out there that's considering starting a YouTube channel, starting a blog, creating content. This is the way it works. And this is why so many people give up and fail, because they just think it's not working when they don't realize that it's not that it's not working. It's just that the algorithm hasn't picked it up. Now, it is true that some people don't have very good, or a lot of people don't have very good content. But if your retention rates are high, if your click-through rates are high, and I'm talking about YouTube specific, then it's just a matter of time before they get it, and then it just completely explodes. So then to further answer your question, the next thing we did is once I got that making payroll, the ad owner, we did an affiliate. No, the first thing I did was consulting. So I think we were charging like $200 or $300 an hour or something like that. I'd sit with someone that wanted to ask me a few questions, and I thought that I'd just get maybe 1 or 2 people a week, and that was exploded. I mean, and after like 2 weeks, I told my assistant, I'm like, okay, we got to stop this. I can't, I don't have time to do this.
It's a great problem. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the first thing. And then we did a couple affiliate deals where I'd have, now my partner in Rebel Capitalist Pro, Chris McIntosh, as an example, would come on, and, I'd interview him, and then he had a research product. So I'd put an affiliate link in the description of the video, and then I would get an affiliate commission for that. And then from there, we just went to Rebel Capitalist Pro, which is the product I now have, which is an online forum that uses back-end research from Lynn Alden, who's quite literally a genius, and Chris McIntosh, who is just an experienced pro, who's a genius himself, but he's more on the, he actually manages money. He's a fund manager. He manages individual accounts, where Lynn is really a research analyst.
Is Rebel Capital, is that a fund that you manage?
No.
I know there's a show, but I saw on your website, it said I couldn't tell if it was investment research or what does Rebel Capital do?
Yeah, so Rebel Capitalist Pro is just this product we have. So it's an online forum. It's a membership forum where it's either $57 a month or $97 a month. And I take the research that Lynn has, and we have that in our forum. And then we have research from Chris as well. And that's kind of, because you don't want me doing research. Trust me, that's the last thing you want. You want the pros doing it. Okay. And so we've got that pro research, and then we've got this online forum where community members go back and forth, they answer each other's questions. It's really it's obviously more, I would say, some kind of lean Austrian, but they like gold, they like Bitcoin, they like things that are cheap, they're value investors. Mm-hmm. And then what we do is once a week, whomever has the most recent research come out, whether that's Lynn or Chris, will do a member live stream Q&A with them. Mm-hmm. So the members get on there and ask their questions directly to Lynn or Chris based on the research that just came out in the forum.
That's so much, man. You're doing a lot, but that's awesome. You mentioned Bitcoin, and I did kind of want to talk to you about that. By the way, I just want to take a time check. Are you okay if we go another 10 minutes or so?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, 15, 10 maybe? Okay.
Sure.
Would you share your thoughts on Bitcoin and in the crypto community?
Yeah, philosophically, I don't think anyone is more aligned with Bitcoin than I am. I absolutely love the concept. It's fantastic. I'm all about decentralization. I mean, I want to end the Fed, for heaven's sakes.
Right.
So obviously, I'm for a decentralized currency.
It's a layup.
For sure. Yeah. As far as its future, I don't know. I think right now it's not realistic to use it as like a global reserve currency because of because it's rather cumbersome at scale. It's great for a few transactions here and there, but to have millions of transactions per second, I don't think it's realistic as it is right now. It's not to say that in the future, super smart people that are way smarter than I am, aren't going to be able to change that to where it could be. And if they can, I'm all for it. As far as digital gold, I don't see that because it only has 10-year track record, and it's volatile. It obviously goes up and down substantially. But where I do like it a lot, as far as from an investment standpoint or a portfolio standpoint, would be in the speculative side of my portfolio. I like to break it down into 3 categories: insurance, which I just consider physical gold. And that's just, you're not buying it to get rich, you're just buying it to stay rich. And then you've got 80% of it, which I consider investment. Now, I would define that as something that pays me to own it. So that would be a bond, a dividend paying stock, real estate, something like that. I don't own any bonds right now, but it's just something that's paying you to own it. Where the speculative side of my portfolio, it doesn't pay you to own it. You're just buying it because you think it's cheap right now. Uranium, I just bought uranium back in March as an example of that. I bought gold miners back in March, another example of that. And Bitcoin, I think, is a great speculation. I don't know if it's cheap. I don't know if it's expensive. I have no way of determining that. But what I do know is there's a lot of asymmetry. And I like asymmetrical bets, as long as the asymmetry favors the upside, not the downside.
I was going to say. So do you like it as a hedge against central bank activity? Maybe. I don't really look at it that way. I don't get into that type of analysis. I don't know that you could really. I mean, it's fun to think about it, but I don't know if I could understand the chances or the probabilities of that direct outcome well enough to actually make a bet. And I mean, it's not really a correlated asset class, which is great. It's not correlated to the stock market or it's bonds or anything. So that's good. But if we had a blow up in fiat currency, you could argue that people would pile into Bitcoin. I think it's been very popular with Venezuelans, with the Chinese. Do Americans do that? Does the government ban the use of Bitcoin? I don't think they can prevent people from using it because it's anonymous, but they could just ban. It'd be like drugs. You can people use heroin, and you can do it at your own risk. But if you get caught, then it's 10 years. So what happens is most people don't usually say no, it's stupid. But other than that, they say, well, I don't want to deal it or whatever because the risk is just, it's not worth the reward.
And I think maybe Bitcoin falls into that category, but I have also heard a lot of strong arguments for central banks actually wanting to hold Bitcoin instead of gold, because in fact, I believe Simon Dixon was the gentleman I was talking to, or maybe it was Preston Pish. I don't know. One of those two guys, I was talking to them, and they really made a fantastic argument for, okay, well, this government's going, they've got this debt problem, and they know that there's only 21 million Bitcoin that can ever be mined, and half of those are lost. So really,
that's right.
It's really more like 10 million. And so, theoretically, it should continue to appreciate because there's a limited supply. Therefore, if central banks start buying it as a kind of a reserve type asset, and they might do that to hopefully try to write down or pay off some of their excessive debt, almost like the central bank is kind of like a hedge fund, which we've seen them behave that way in the past.
Right.
So they start buying Bitcoin, and because the float is so limited in Bitcoin, maybe that drives up the price to where you don't have governments attacking Bitcoin or being anti-Bitcoin. Potentially, you could have governments that are very, very pro Bitcoin.
Right.
I think the probabilities of that are maybe a little bit lower than the government's banning it. But I think there's a real strong argument, a real well thought out argument for both. And I just don't know what's going to happen. That's why I see the asymmetry there. But even in the speculative side of my portfolio, I like to usually allocate about 10% to that. I wouldn't allocate the whole 10%. Now, that doesn't mean that it's right or wrong.
Right.
I'm just telling you that's what I do personally. Right. And again, I'm an amateur. I'm just the average Joe. So I'm not one of the professionals. So take it with a grain of salt. But I would maybe do like 1% or something like that in Bitcoin. Interesting.
Well, Bitcoin and crypto have kind of been taboo for a while, and now you're starting to see at least Bitcoin become a household name. And so I noticed recently, I follow the World Economic Forum. At least I keep them on my radar because they seem to be this think tank, and they recommend policy, and it tends to trickle down. And there's Davos, which happens every January, and the most powerful people in the world go there. And so I'm checking out, I stay on top of them. And you did a video about, they have a whole new page on their website called the Global Reset Agenda. The Great Reset. Right.
Yeah.
And it is a little creepy when you start looking at the verbiage and you look at this guy, Klaus, and your video was hilarious. It's definitely stiff drink time talking about this man. It's hilarious. So what do you make of all this? They're embracing blockchain. They talk a lot about it. They think in many instances it's the right way forward. What do you think their real agenda is? Do they have, by the way, first of all, is there a secret agenda there, or do you think they're being completely open and transparent?
Number one, I don't trust them. And I have no hard evidence. I have no real rationale for that opinion, other than as an entrepreneur and as an employer, over the span of my, I don't know if you want to call it a career or whatever, I've worked with, hired, literally thousands of employees, not at one time, but throughout the decade or 12, 15 years, whatever. And I still have 25 employees. So I'm dealing with people all the time. And back then, you're dealing with sales, I'm just constantly dealing with people. So as an entrepreneur, it's not mandatory, but you do a lot better the better you're able to read people. And when I would interview people, I'd tell them to bring in a resume just because it makes them feel good. But I could care less what was on their resume. I wouldn't even look at it. Right. The only thing, because everyone's going to bullshit their resume anyway. Right. So all I would do is all I want them to do is talk to me. So I just ask them questions, and I don't care what their answers are. I just want to hear them talk. I want to see them talk, because with their mannerisms, with the way they carry themselves, with their posture, I can read someone very well. And if you look at that video, or look at all of them, and you try to read those people, I wouldn't I wouldn't trust them with my 8-year-old. Let's just say that. And so, are they nefarious? What's their intentions? I don't know. But if I had to if I had to estimate the probabilities, I think the most likely scenario is they don't care about they don't care about global warming or climate change. They don't care about blockchain. They don't care about any of this stuff. What they care about is increasing taxes. What they care about is increasing regulation, which basically gives them more control. They want power. And I think this is just a convenient excuse for them to push a narrative that is going to give them more power. And I'm not saying that those narratives aren't, or those, programs or these things aren't important, or that we shouldn't focus on them, or we shouldn't be trying to figure out solutions, a free market solution I would encourage for some things like climate change, let's say. I'm not saying that. I'm not here to debate one side or the other, but what I am saying is I don't think that that's their main agenda, let's call it. And that's giving them the benefit of the doubt. I think some people would take it a lot deeper than that and say, well, this agenda seems to, or this virus seems to be very convenient for them to come out with this quote unquote great reset type of agenda that just happens to give them a lot more power and control these things. And it's just, the bottom line is I am not in favor of any centralized type of power, whether it's Klaus and his cronies at the World Economic Forum, whether it's the European Union, whether it's the federal government. I'm much more in favor of the states. I'm in favor of a bottoms-up approach to everything, because I think individuals can make the best decisions for themselves, for their business, and for their own family. And that will always be the case. Klaus is never, ever, ever going to understand YouTube as well as I do. He's never going to understand your business. He's never going to understand the needs or the wants of the families of the individuals who are watching this or listening to this right now. And there's no way to micromanage that. If you do, regardless of the benefit, the cost will always be higher. So those are my main takeaways from that video. And I think people should watch it, and they can come to their own conclusion.
Take a look for yourself, guys. It's creepy.
Yeah, it is.
That's for sure.
That's for sure.
Well, I totally agree with you. Look, you've been very generous with your time, George. I have to say thank you very much for coming on. I have one last question for you.
Yeah.
Look, I think you're one of the best channels on YouTube. You're one of my top 3 for sure. I listen every week. But I'm curious, who's your favorite YouTube channel? Who do you watch every day or every week?
Well, in this space, my favorites are Macro Voices, Real Vision, my buddy Jeff Snyder and Emil Kalinowski. They're Making Sense podcast. Anything Grant Williams does. Let's see, who else? I'm just, the Shift show is great. I listen to a lot of libertarian shows. I listen to Tom Woods all the time. Listen to Bob Murphy. He's more of an Austrian economist. I'm just trying to think of the podcasts that I have queued up in my phone right now. Those are the main ones, but I'm always watching internet or YouTube interviews from people who I really like Dunlop as an example, Stan Druckenmiller, Jim Rogers. Anytime I see those people pop up on my home screen, I try to watch that video. And then the other stuff is more, it's just how to be better at YouTube. So there's like video creators, video influencers, Brian G. Johnson, Nick Nimmin. These are all YouTube channels that I obsess over, because it's just how to get better and better at YouTube. So most people might not know it, but I'm doing everything I can to improve the videos, to make them better, to tell more stories, because I know that's, as humans, that's how we learn, and that's what we like to listen to. And I may have gotten sidetracked a little bit here just because of my personal situation. St. Bart's, obviously, and this little Airbnb villa that I have is not ideal for producing whiteboard videos. I'm having to just kind of piece everything together with it and duct tape. But the long-term strategy is to get back to either Medellin or someplace where I've got more of a studio type setting and just continue to improve the content. And I think if you do that, everything falls into place, whether it's monetizing or really what I get so much value out of now is just having the opportunity to discuss these types of topics with individuals such as yourself, and then people that I've really looked up to, and I still do, such as Snyder, Brent Johnson, Luke Groman, Hugh Hendry, who I've had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with here on the island, and that's what really that's the value proposition for me, for sure.
That's awesome, man. I'm really glad that you're doing it. I think you're gonna have a large and expanding fan base, because the macro conversation, it's like anybody interested in learning about how any system works, it's almost like you end up in macro, whether you're just interested in politics or maybe you're only interested in the economy. Eventually, if you follow it long enough, you have to start looking at these macro issues because of globalization, because of the way that money flows and the way the resources are allocated. You always end up there. And I think you're one of the leading voices in this space. So again, thank you, sir. I'm so glad you spent the time with me.
For the kind words.
All right, George, keep doing what you do, and we'll be in touch soon, okay?
Awesome. Look forward to it.
Thanks, brother. Bye.